Jeremy Bentham was a British philosopher and a social reformer who is considered to be the founder of modern utilitarianism. Essentially, that's the view that there are no natural laws or rights. Bentham believed that the ultimate reckoning of right and wrong, of just and unjust, could be determined by somehow tabulating the greatest happiness enjoyed by the greatest number of people. In that utilitarian perspective, transparency, which we can equate with the lack of privacy, had a high utilitarian value. In his essay on deontology, a term that focuses on the study of the perceived rightness and wrongness of decisions, Bentham concluded that the ideal world is one in which each, quote, gesture, every turn of limb or feature in those whose emotions have a visible impact on the general happiness will be noticed and taken account of. In this view, we can extrapolate that surveillance itself, though perhaps not solely by the state, has in Bentham's view a positive effect on maintaining order. Few people today would embrace as beneficial Bentham's image of complete transparency. Rather, Bentham is remembered as having given voice to a horrifying dystopian vision. The extreme of this view is best captured, I think, in the image of an institutional building, a jail, designed by Bentham and known as the Panopticon. It was circular, with the prisoners, or if you prefer to think of it, the hotel guests, all housed in rooms along the rim of the building. The rooms consisted of a transparent inner wall that allowed any watcher at the center to see into the inmate's jail cell or the guest's hotel room. The idea was to allow a single watchman to monitor all of the inmates of the institution without himself being observed. The watcher, on the other hand, was obscured behind a one-way glass so that the inmates would not know when they were being watched or by whom. As a result, in Bentham's view, the inmates, or guests, would always behave themselves. He thought that the uncertainty presented by this anonymous, invisible form of surveillance was so great and the efficiency so high that you could likely actually do away with the watcher altogether. Now, by this point, you can see why the image of the Panopticon resonates so strongly in today's debate. What Bentham saw as a utilitarian good, we see as the ultimate in Big Brother. In the same way, our current privacy rules are simply not up to the task of anticipating and accommodating every demand for interpretation or application presented to them in the privacy debate. They are, to a very real degree, relics of the last century. Many of the relevant federal statutes and Supreme Court precedents date from the 1970s. So rather than focus on law, let's talk about privacy as a defined set of practices and processes. Our concepts of privacy today are largely embedded in a set of principles known as the Fair Information Practice Principles, sometimes known as the FIPS, which the United States developed in the early 1970s and which are the keystone of the Privacy Act of 1974. The principles state that a government should limit the collection of personal information to what is necessary, use it only for specific and limited purposes, be transparent and open with the public about how the information is collected and used, and allow the individual about whom the data is collected to see the data and correct it if necessary. Now, you can probably see the problem already. New technologies such as drones, biometrics, and big data collection and analysis just destroy these types of rules. A conscientious and fair application of such principles is, in many ways, fundamentally inconsistent with the way in which personal information is used in the context of counterterrorism, or for that matter, in commercial data analysis. Consider as just one example of this the purpose and use specification principle, which states generally that data collected for one purpose should not be used for another. If universally applied, this principle would make it impossible for many sophisticated knowledge discovery systems based on big data analysis to work well. Often, the data that provides us with the necessary missing link from law enforcement to scientific research is information that was collected for a different purpose and intended for a different use. As the President's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology has said, the idea of notice and consent as a limit on collection is defeated by exactly the positive benefits that big data enables: new, non-obvious, unexpectedly powerful uses of data. In short, in a world of widely distributed networks with massive data storage capacity and computational capacity, so much analysis becomes possible that the old principles no longer fit. What is needed then is a modern conception of privacy, one with enough flexibility to allow effective government action, but with the surety necessary to protect against governmental abuse. Some people think the old privacy rules should be reinforced. Me, I tend to think that's a mug's game, and that technology is forcing change. In my own view, the old ideas of collection and purpose limitation are obsolete, and they need to be replaced because they can't withstand the onslaught of new privacy-invading technology that all, or almost all of us, embrace. Instead, we should focus on how data is used. And more importantly, we should recalibrate our laws so that our concern is not with uses that are mere analyses, but rather with uses that constitute the imposition of some adverse consequence. What I mean by that is that the focus should turn to actual harm to an individual. If the analysis, for example, wrongly puts him on a no-fly list or denies him a job, that would be the sort of adverse consequence we should strive to avoid. Here are a couple of building blocks for this idea. First, we really need to dig deep into what we mean by privacy. Privacy is a misnomer in some respects. What it reflects is a desire for the independence of personal activity, a form of autonomy. And we protect that privacy in many ways. Sometimes we do so through secrecy, which effectively obscures the observation of conduct and the identity of those engaging in the conduct. An example of this is the voting booth, where who you are and what you do are actually physically obscured behind a screen to preserve the unimpeded freedom of your democratic choice. In other instances, as when we talk about privacy rights in connection with freedom of religion or the right to marry whom you want, we protect your autonomy directly by allowing you to exercise your individual choice of conduct. Indeed, the whole point of that kind of privacy is to allow people to act as they wish in public, which is a very different way of looking at privacy. Anonymity is a third concept of privacy, the one that is most relevant to our consideration of the changes brought about by new technology. It's kind of a middle ground where observation is permitted, that is, where we expose our actions in public, but where our identities and our intentions are not ordinarily subject to close scrutiny. In everyday life, we leave behind an electronic data trail that is suffused with information of this middle sort. Bank account transactions, phone records, airplane reservations, smart card travel logs, to name just a few. Likewise, in the physical realm, what hackers call meat space of biometrics and drones, it often involves the collection of publicly exposed information in which we also have an anonymity-based privacy interest. These forms of information, partially public but with an overlay of privacy, constitute the core of the transactions and information available to governments today. The type of anonymity that one has in respect of activities in the electronic realm or under the gaze of unseen drones is not terribly different from the type of anonymity we have every day in our physical existence. Consider as a simple example the act of driving a car. It's done in public, but one is generally not subject to routine identification and scrutiny on the road between your home and the office or the grocery store. Protecting the anonymity we value requires, in the first instance, defining it accurately. Now, one might posit that anonymity is, in effect, the ability to walk through the world unexamined. That is, however, not strictly accurate, for our conduct is examined numerous times every day. Sometimes the examination is by a private individual. For example, you might notice that the individual sitting next to you on the train or plane or bus is wearing a wedding ring or a business suit or a Hawaiian shirt. What conclusions do you draw? Other routine examinations are by governmental authorities and commercial entities, like the policeman in the car who watches the street, or the security camera that records you at the bank or airport. So what we really must mean by anonymity is not a pure form of privacy akin to secrecy. Rather, what we mean is that even though one's conduct is examined routinely and regularly, both with and without our knowledge, nothing adverse should happen to us without good cause. In other words, the veil of anonymity is now readily pierced by technology. So, to actively protect privacy that otherwise is compromised by the new technology, we need to formulate rules that prescribe limits to the unwanted and undesirable intrusions. These rules are needed to protect our privacy and prevent governmental abuse. The key to this conception is that privacy's principal virtue is a limitation on consequence. In the context of governmental oversight, the questions to be asked of any new surveillance program are, what is the consequence of identification? What is the trigger for that consequence? And who decides when the trigger is met? So now we've got a consequence-based definition of privacy. How do we protect it? And its essential component of anonymity. The traditional system was a system of rules and a system of oversight and compliance for those rules. Here, too, modifications need to be made, I think, in light of technological change. Rules, for example, are static, and they tend to be unchanging, and they don't account readily for changes in technology. Indeed, the Privacy Act, the central statute intended to protect individual privacy against government intrusion, is a solution that instead is emblematic of the underlying problem. The principles of the Privacy Act are ill-suited to most new technological methodologies. The law was designed and passed at a time when the only way we could imagine organizing data was based on the name of the person to whom it related. In modern databases, we can sort the data in any one of multiple ways. For these reasons, we've begun to develop new systems and structures to replace the old privacy systems. First, we're changing the way we protect privacy from a top-down process of rules to one in which the principal means of privacy protection is through institutional oversight. For example, when Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, it included the requirement that the department have an in-house privacy officer and another for civil rights and civil liberties. The 2004 Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act and the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007 went further. Together, they outlined the requirement for a civil liberties protection officer within the intelligence community. More generally, the Independent Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board now oversees all intelligence activities. This is a good set of changes. These institutions are, in effect, internal watchdogs for privacy concerns. In addition, they naturally serve as a focus for external complaints, requiring them to exercise some of the functions of an ombudsman, if you will. In either capacity, they're in a position to influence and change how the government approaches the privacy of its citizens. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, The very same surveillance systems our government uses to advance its interests are equally well suited to ensure that government officials comply with the limitations imposed on them in respect of individual privacy. Put another way, some surveillance systems can be uniquely well equipped to watch the watchers. And there are already indications that strong audit mechanisms, when in place, can be effective. Recall the incident in the 2008 presidential campaign, when contractors at the Department of State hacked into Barack Obama's passport file. In this instance, there was no lawful reason for the disclosure of the file. It was leaked for prurient political reasons. But a strong audit function quickly identified the wrongdoers and allowed corrective action to be taken. If we did reconfigure our conception of privacy, put the right control systems in place, and used a strong audit system for the government, we could have a reasonably confident, consequence-based system of privacy protection that would move us toward a place where real legal protections could be maintained. It wouldn't be perfect. There would always be mistakes and abuses, and it would be a lot more difficult to manage in the real world than the cut-and-dried pure privacy protections we have in place now. But we need a solution that is more in sync with today's technological realities, and what I've outlined should, I think, at least get us a little closer. So let's turn from the government and its collection of private data to the commercial sector. Here we see a whole different set of challenges. To begin with, the Constitution doesn't apply to private commercial actors. The Constitution's Fourth Amendment serves only as a limit on government activity. So that's not a potential avenue for protecting privacy. On the other hand, the field is wide open for Congress to regulate. Unlike government surveillance, where the purpose is at least theoretically to protect national security, when Congress steps in to limit commercial surveillance, the only negative consequence might be to interfere in the development of new technologies and markets. I don't mean to diminish the costs involved with that kind of interference in the market. Far from it. At this point, the value of commercial use of new technology has become so deeply embedded in the business model of corporate America that it'll be difficult to modify. After all, why do you think that Facebook and Google and lots of other web-based services are free? You aren't paying upfront for those services. But of course, you're paying in another way, often with information about you. Commercial companies value that information. It lets them know what to sell you or how to try and influence you. In a very real way, some web services are free precisely because the accumulation of your data is their product. If we change that business model, and we can, then in the end you will have to pay for some web-based services that currently have no direct cost to you. However, in the commercial sphere, we're already moving toward a system that looks like my consequence idea of privacy. In order to protect your privacy and prevent the misuse of your data, you need to know what will happen to it. And you need to be able to control the use of it. Slowly, the laws are moving in that direction. Increasingly, companies are being criticized for overly invasive uses of your data. And they are changing what they do. Throughout the world, but especially in Europe, free web-based services are being called to account and told to publicize what they do and to build in options that allow you to manage how your data is collected and used. The commercial sector is resisting, but the trend is, I think, pretty clear. I started this lecture with a discussion of Bentham's Panopticon, a parable about the dangers of pervasive surveillance. This discussion of privacy and surveillance would not be complete, however, without presenting the opposite point of view, as captured in the story of the Ring of Gyges. This story is far older than Bentham's transparency tale, coming down to us from Socrates' inquiry into certain questions about justice that appeal to him, and which are recounted in Plato's Republic. Early in Book 2 of the Republic, Socrates considers what it is that makes men just, by which he meant someone who was moral and acted in a just manner. Glaucon, One of the participants in the Socratic dialogue offers the view that morality is nothing more than a social construction, and that citizens are virtuous and just only because they fear sanction for acting in an unjust manner. To illustrate this, Glaucon introduces a discussion of the Ring of Gyges, a mythical magical ring that renders the wearer invisible, much like the One Ring of Power in The Lord of Rings. What Glaucon wonders is, what would cause a man to be just and virtuous if he had such a ring? His view is that no man would be of, quote, such an iron nature that he would stand fast in justice, end quote, if he could engage in unjust behavior without any fear of punishment. Glaucon's idea is consistent with at least some of our experience, which is that in the absence of consequences and in the absence of surveillance, social order can break down. So this parable is the flip side of Bentham's concept of pervasive surveillance. It tells us that sometimes surveillance is essential to order and society. And that leads us to the last piece of the privacy puzzle to put on the table for discussion today. As Bentham inferred, a flip side to the loss of privacy is a gain in transparency. This can be valuable to the extent that it gives citizens insight into actions of their governments. And just as citizens find that they are losing their privacy, we're quickly coming to the point where governments won't be able to keep secrets very well either. A great example of this is the growing use of digital video to film police actions and document possible abuses. This type of surveillance is sometimes called sousveillance, meaning inverse surveillance, using monitoring technology to watch the watchers or other powerful entities. The French term sous means under or subordinate, and it's used to capture the idea of watching from below. That is, the people watching the government or the state rather than the other way around. One example that comes to mind tells this story and illustrates it rather well. It involves the death of a Hamas operative in Dubai. On January 19, 2010, Hamas commander Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, one of the founders of the Palestinian group's military wing, was murdered in his hotel. Suspicion, naturally, fell on Israel, since the Israeli government would be among the few actors anywhere in the world with a motive to kill al-Mabhouh and the means to do so. Suspicion soon led to proof. The law enforcement authorities in Dubai were able to identify a hit squad with more than 20 members who were responsible for the killing. Many of them had traveled to Dubai on fraudulent passports. How the government made the connection shows just how difficult it is to keep secrets these days. To begin with, some of the team were spotted on security camera footage in the hotel, acting suspiciously. 2 were seen putting on disguises in a hotel bathroom, and 2 others hung out in the lobby in tennis clothes for hours on end. But the hotel surveillance footage was just the beginning of the story. According to the Israeli investigative reporter Ronen Bergman, the hit team apparently did not anticipate the ability of the Dubai authorities to piece together bits of data from disparate databases. They were overconfident. For starters, the assassins' activities were tracked through a series of transactions using prepaid debit cards. The operatives all used the same type of card issued through a small bank in Iowa. They were also connected through phone records. The team members used phone numbers in Austria as a relay station to route calls amongst themselves. As Bergman puts it, since dozens of calls were made to and from this short list of Austrian numbers over the period of less than 2 days, the moment that the cover of a single operative was blown and his cell phone records became available to the authorities, all others who called or received calls from the same number were at risk of being identified. Another piece of the puzzle was a trick that United States officials had taught the Dubai authorities. That is, the analysis of travel records. Dubai authorities searched their customs and immigration databases to identify anyone who entered Dubai shortly before the killing and left shortly afterwards. Then they cross-referenced this result against lists of visitors who were in Dubai during al-Mabhouth's previous visits to the United Arab Emirates. This created a target list of possible suspects which could be matched against hotel registries. Video footage of check-in at the airport was then matched to faces and names. As a consequence, the Dubai authorities were able to compile a meticulous video record of the hit team from the Israeli intelligence service, finding video both of the day of the murder and their earlier visits to Dubai. Finally, the Dubai authorities publicly published on TV the passport photos of the suspects, leading to near certain identification of the assassins. It isn't just the Mossad that has such problems maintaining secrecy of a covert operation. Today, all spy agencies do. The development of technology has made it very difficult, for example, for an undercover spy to move around with a false identity. Too many trails in cyberspace can provide evidence that such an identity is a recent creation. A credit card was issued very recently. The biometric data on the passport links to the person's true identity in a database somewhere. The claimed employment record can't be verified. All of these background facts are now subject to being researched further and almost instantaneously makes the revelation of falsehoods or disguises an increasingly easier task. We may well be reaching the point where human spying based on fictitious identities becomes a thing of the past, at least as we presently know it, and all thanks to the internet. While some governments might think that's a problem, some people might believe it's a good thing. If you want another example of the new transparency, think of this. Let's recall again how a team of U.S. Navy SEALs flew into Abbottabad, Pakistan, and killed Osama bin Laden. Before they did that, they practiced on a mock-up of bin Laden's compound constructed in secret by the U.S. government. Well, maybe not so secret. It turns out that Microsoft's Bing Maps application had a satellite picture of the facility online. Someone recognized it for what it was and publicized it in October 2012, long after the compound had been destroyed and bin Laden killed. But what if the picture had been recognized before the raid? How you feel about transparency might depend on whether you favor or oppose what it reveals. And even if you think that the bin Laden example is an easy one, you probably agree that there will be harder cases in the gray areas. Privacy and transparency are two sides of one coin, I think. And we associate very different values with each of them, depending upon how they're applied and to what end. So let's return to where we began, with the eccentric and extreme case of Jeremy Bentham. Say what you will about Bentham, he was no hypocrite. He lived and died according to his utilitarian, anti-privacy, pro-transparency views. When he passed away, his body was preserved in a mummified state and put on public display. You can still see him, encased in glass, at the University College of London, where, in death as in life, Bentham is completely transparent to all those around him. Most of the rest of us are probably somewhere nearer the middle. We neither want to live in a panopticon world of one-way surveillance, nor do we wish to live in a world where some can live invisibly, possessing the ring of Gyges. Privacy, at bottom, requires a balance.